This is a grand saga spanning 3 centuries, a brutal epic etched into the very spine of the Eurasian steppe. It was more than a struggle for survival. It was the first systemic confrontation between sedentary and nomadic civilizations in human history. The world bore witness to how an ancient empire, through 70 years of stoic forbearance, gathered its thunder. Beneath the humiliation of marriage alliances and annual tributes, it achieved a glorious metamorphosis, from strategic retreat to the ultimate counteroffensive, from border defense to total triumph. This 300-year war, especially the centurial strategic cycle of its early stages, fused unconventional fiscal logic, professionalized heavy cavalry, and a logistical miracle spanning tens of thousands of miles. At a near-tragic cost, it demonstrated the zenith of state mobilization in the pre-industrial era. For China, it secured over 2 million square kilometers of territory, serving as the foundational struggle for the legal sovereignty of almost the entire northwest of modern China. Yet, from a global perspective, the exploratory diplomacy, initiated to break the blockade, unexpectedly opened the Silk Road, the artery connecting east and west. Military diplomacy evolved into the first pulse of global trade, turning a byproduct of expansion into a foundational right for human civilization. Of course, none of this compares to the geopolitical domino effect triggered by this conflict. As the Han heavy cavalry drove the northern hurricane deep into the heart of the Mobe Desert, the compressed nomadic forces became a geopolitical shockwave in the Eurasian interior. Like a piston, it pushed migrations and collisions westward, shattering the tranquility of Central Asia. Centuries later, this evolved into the Great Migration that swept across Europe, indirectly tolling the death knell for the Western Roman Empire. A single deep breath on the eastern plains transformed into a storm 10,000 miles away. It did more than forge the Han people's sense of territory and soul. In a sense, it redistributed the evolutionary genes of global civilization. The Han-Xiongnu War was no longer merely a dynastic border narrative. It became a paradigm-shifting, strategic turning point that reshaped the Afro-Eurasian landscape and linked the fates of East and West. Today, we begin by introducing the geopolitical relationships and entangled interests of this war, as well as the Han Empire's passivity and forbearance during the initial decades. Most importantly, we will introduce you to the first steppe empire in human history and the despair-inducing power it commanded. Imagine a map of Eastern Eurasia in the 2nd century BC, 2 colossi facing off across a vast border. To the south, the Han dynasty, an agrarian empire of nearly 60 million people slowly recovering from the fires of war. To the north, the Xiongnu, a massive nomadic confederation controlling territory from northeast to Central Asia. No one knows the true origins of the Xiongnu. As Huaxia civilization began its agrarian journey in the Yellow River Valley, a primal force lay hidden in the depths of the Yin Mountains and the Gobi Desert, pulsing silently with the seasonal rhythm of the grasslands. They emerged from the shadows of myth, perhaps the exiled descendants of the Xia dynasty, or the trembling spirits of the Xianyun and Hunzhou, forged and reforged over 10,000 years. This was a life form fundamentally different from the agrarian world. They had no walled cities, yet they owned the sky. They sowed no grain, yet they thrived on the wind, the frost, and sheer mobility. During the Warring States era, the Xiongnu were already a titan of the north. Though Qin Shi Huang sent General Meng Tian with 300,000 troops to drive them south of the Yellow River, it was merely a temporary compression of the storm. The Chinese built the Great Wall, hoping for a barrier between civilization and savagery, between plough and pasture. But how could a static wall secure such a vast frontier? In the transition between the Qin and Han, the northern defenses crumbled. The Xiongnu struck deep into the heartland, plundering and killing. They even conspired with border kings and nobles to invade the interior. the Great Wall became a phantom. When Liu Bang finally reunified China, after years of bloody conflict, he looked north with confidence. Leading a massive army, he sought not only to punish traitors, but to use the momentum of his civil war victory to solve the Xiongnu problem once and for all. But Liu Bang was a man of the south. He did not understand the dangers of the north. In the bitter cold of the Mobe Desert, an unprecedented political structure was undergoing a dark metamorphosis. At the center of this fission was a man named Modu. As the eldest son of a chieftain, Modu had been traded as a hostage to a rival nation by his own father. After a miraculous escape, he realized that if the nomads were to defeat the sedentary empire of the south, they needed a discipline that transcended bloodlines and tribal traditions. He invented the whistling arrow, Mingdi, a bolt that shrieked through the air and gave his elite cavalry a lethal command. "Wherever my arrow flies, you must all shoot. Hesitate and be executed." To test their loyalty, Modu first fired at his finest steed, then at his favorite wife. When the hesitant were executed on the spot, his army became a cold, human machine. Finally, during a hunt, Modu aimed the whistling arrow at his own father. 10,000 arrows took flight. In that moment, the tribal traditions of the old world ended. The Xiongnu Empire, human history's first true steppe empire, was born in a bath of blood. Why do we call the Xiongnu the first steppe empire instead of the Scythians? In Western history, the Scythian horsemen of the Eastern European plains were legendary, but they remained a loose confederation of warriors. When Darius the Great invaded, they used guerrilla tactics to force a retreat, but they never established a lasting, stable administrative system. The Xiongnu under Modu were different. He established the Three Wings 24 Chiefs system, creating the center, the left wing, and the right wing, three independent yet unified components of the empire. This structure permeated political, social, and military life, ensuring tribal autonomy while binding them to a single imperial framework. This was the perfect political system for the unique environment of the steppe, becoming the blueprint for every steppe empire for the next millennium. In terms of legitimacy, he mirrored the Central Plain dynasties by establishing the steppe's own mandate of heaven. He was the great Chanyu, born of heaven and earth, established by the sun and moon. This celestial mandate was later adopted by the Turks and Mongols. Records state that by the early Han, Modu commanded 300,000 warriors of the bow. Crucially, these were no longer primitive tribes with bone arrows. This was a war machine with iron blast furnaces and military production lines, absorbing the advanced craftsmanship of the Qin and Han. In summary, Liu Bang and Han Wangxin thought they were facing a nuisance of nomadic beggars. In reality, they were facing the first unified steppe empire. They were facing the Qin Shi Huang of the Great Grasslands. He had unified the tribes, crushed his powerful neighbors, the Donghu to the east and the Yuezhi to the west, and conquered dozens of nations to build the first true empire of the steppe. In 200 BC, history pushed two of the world's most formidable forces to the brink of a decisive confrontation. In the south, the Han dynasty had just emerged from years of grueling civil war. Liu Bang, the founding emperor, had reconstructed order from the ruins. At the zenith of his power, he had not only unified a fractured China, but commanded a massive, battle-hardened army of infantry. When Liu Bang led 300,000 Han troops across the freezing Luliang Mountains to solve the northern border threat once and for all, they found only the elderly, the weak, and abandoned camps intentionally left behind by the Xiongnu. Lured by this deception, Liu Bang took his elite vanguard and broke away from the main army, accelerating his pursuit northward. Filled with pride, he believed he was destined to be the first conqueror to tame the great wilderness. He failed to notice that on Baideng Mountain, near the city of Pingcheng, the howling wind and snow were masking the dangerous neighing of hidden war horses. Due to his overconfidence, Liu Bang and his vanguard were lured into a massive encirclement. 40,000 elite Xiongnu cavalry moved like a tide, severing all supply lines for the Han army. This became the infamous Siege of Baideng. Trapped on the mountain peak for 7 days, the Han soldiers were without food, and the extreme cold caused many to lose their fingers to frostbite. Facing total annihilation, Liu Bang, the man who had defeated every hero in China, was forced to bribe the Chanyu's favorite consort and engage in secret political negotiations to secure a narrow escape route. This battle taught Liu Bang a brutal lesson. Traditional infantry formations could not defeat the elusive nomadic cavalry in the vast wilderness. China, exhausted by civil war and with an empty treasury, was in no position to sustain a prolonged international conflict. To survive, the Han Empire accepted an agonizing and humiliating choice: Hekin, or the marriage alliance. This was no romantic aristocratic wedding. It was a highly systemic peace treaty designed to avoid total war. Under the treaty, the Han recognized the Xiongnu as an equal power, even nominally referring to the Chanyu as an elder brother. In exchange, the Han had to regularly send vast quantities of supplies to the steppe, including silk, spirits, and grain. But the most symbolic and painful price for the Waxia civilization was the requirement to send a royal princess to be married to the Xiongnu leader. In 198 BC, the first bridal carriage slowly rolled out of the Great Wall. Liu Bang had initially considered sending his own daughter, but following the Empress's desperate pleas, a young woman was chosen from the broader royal clan, titled Princess, and escorted into the bitter cold of a land where no woman of a sedentary civilization had ever stepped. For her, it was permanent exile, leaving behind exquisite palaces, a familiar language, and a mild climate for a world of felt tents, nomadic diets, and alien customs. At the time, these marriages were viewed as political submission. For the Xiongnu, marrying a Han princess meant a steady supply of wealth and political recognition from a powerful sedentary empire. For the Han, it was strategic forbearance, buying time for national reconstruction. These lonely princesses and their caravans became the fragile lubricant between two clashing empires. Though this systemic compromise was seen by later generations as a profound shame, it worked. Large-scale war was temporarily quelled. The Han won the precious opportunity to rest and recover, accumulating grain in the fields and breeding war horses in the pastures. However, this peace, bought with gold and women, was built on shifting sands. With every princess who crossed the Great Wall, the thirst for vengeance within the Han heartland intensified. This forbearance was not just for survival, it was for the day the empire's sword would be forged anew to shatter the nightmare of generations. The peace following the Siege of Baideng was a mere illusion. For the young Han Empire, sending princesses and massive wealth did not buy true tranquility. It transformed the alarm of war into a long-term systemic extortion. From the death of Liu Bang in 195 BC through the next 70 years, history bore witness to the ultimate strategic endurance of a great empire. After Liu Bang's death, his widow, Empress Lu, became the de facto ruler. During this time, Modu Chanyu sent a formal letter to the widowed Empress. In it, the steppe hegemon wrote with insulting flippancy, "I am a lonely monarch, born in the marshes and raised among cattle and horses. You are also alone now. Neither of us is happy. Why don't we exchange what we have, and you marry me?" To the Huaxia civilization, which prized ritual and dignity, this letter was an unprecedented humiliation. It was not just personal harassment of the Empress Dowager. It was a public shaming of a sedentary civilization by a nomadic culture that viewed women as spoils of war. The Han court was outraged. One general drew his sword on the spot, demanding to lead 100,000 troops into the steppe. However, logic eventually overrode anger. Empress Lu remembered the agony of Baideng. For the survival of the nation, she suppressed her fury. She replied to the Chanyu with forced humility. "I am old and frail. My hair is falling out, my teeth are loose, and I have trouble walking. I am truly unworthy of the Chanyu." Along with the letter, she sent lavish royal carriages and a promise to maintain the Heqin alliance. By the reign of Emperor Wen, the empire's economy began to recover, but the border nightmare intensified. The Xiongnu began to treat the treaties as waste paper. Whenever they felt the Han tributes were not arriving fast or plentifully enough, they used force to collect. In 177 BC, the Xiongnu wise king of the right broke through the border and set up camp directly on Han territory, south of the Yellow River. Though Emperor Wen sent troops to drive them out, he immediately dispatched messengers with even more gold and silk to plead for the restoration of the marriage alliance, fearing to provoke the main Xiongnu force. The greatest crisis, however, erupted in 166 BC. The newly ascended Chanyu, seeking to display his power, led 140,000 fully armored heavy cavalry in a total breach of all treaties, invading like a hurricane. This time, the nomadic army struck hundreds of kilometers into the Han heartland, burning one of Emperor Wen's royal summer palaces. The Xiongnu vanguard even approached the Gangquan Palace, dangerously close to the capital, Chang'an. For months, residents of the capital could see the beacon fires of the northern border lighting up the night sky. When the breeze blew, they could smell the smoke from Xiongnu camps. The entire Han Empire was paralyzed by panic. Emperor Wen put on heavy armor, intending to lead the fight personally, but was stopped by the desperate pleas of his ministers. By the time the Han finally assembled a massive counterattack force, the Xiongnu had retreated into the vast desert, carrying away loads of loot, slaves, and livestock. Facing a devastated border, Emperor Wen had no choice but to humiliatingly send envoys again the following year, increasing the annual tribute and sending yet another royal princess to the steppe. This humiliation continued into the reign of Emperor Jing. At that time, the Han Empire was engulfed in a massive internal conflict known as the Rebellion of the Seven States. The empire was like a patient undergoing open-heart surgery, extremely vulnerable. The Xiongnu gathered like vultures beyond the Great Wall, ready to swoop down. To avoid a two-front war, Emperor Jing issued a strict order. The border armies were forbidden from attacking. No matter how much the Xiongnu provoked them, they had to hold their positions. Simultaneously, the Han doubled the supply of wealth to stabilize these nomadic predators. During this long period of forbearance, the Han border was like a broken ATM. When the Xiongnu were happy, they sent envoys for money and grain. When they were not, they rode across the wall to pillage. The Han border guards even formed an absurd unspoken agreement. As long as the Xiongnu didn't strike the heartland, a little raiding of border villages was treated as extra tribute. But behind this endless compromise, the seeds of vengeance were growing wildly underground. While enduring humiliation, the Han monarchs quietly implemented state capitalist economic reforms. By the early years of Emperor Wu, though arrogant Xiongnu cavalry still roamed outside the Great Wall, the scene inside the wall had changed completely. The cords used to string coins in the Han treasury had rotted from disuse. The grain in the granaries was so abundant it spilled outside and spoiled. Most importantly, through generations of endurance, the Han had secretly bred hundreds of thousands of superior warhorses in national stud farms. Though the Han Empire had accumulated staggering wealth within its borders, on the geopolitical map, it remained a nation locked in a cage. At this time, the Xiongnu Empire was at the zenith of its power under Modu Chanyu, a strategic web that threatened to swallow the Han North entirely. The Xiongnu domain stretched from the Greater Khingan Mountains in the east to the Pamir Mountains in the west, and reached as far north as Lake Baikal. They controlled over 9 million square kilometers, 3 times the size of the Han Empire, and more than 4 times that of the Roman Empire in the west. Along the Han's long and crumbling northern border, the Xiongnu deployed a crescent of death, encompassing the empire from east to west. In the east, their cavalry could surge over the Taihang Mountains to threaten the agrarian heartlands of the North China Plain. However, the 2 geographical pillars that truly haunted the Han monarchs were the Hitao region and the Hexi Corridor. One was a dagger pressed against the Han Empire's jugular. The other was an iron chain tightened around its neck. The Hitao region, then known as Henandi, the land south of the Yellow River's Great Bend, was a God-given oasis of lush pastures. It was also the most fatal breach in the northern Great Wall defense line. For nomadic cavalry, the greatest constraints were water and fodder. The rich vegetation of Hetao meant the Xiongnu did not need to launch raids from the distant, bitter cold of Mobei. They could use this region as a perfect forward operating base. Hundreds of thousands of cavalry could graze and rest here, ensuring their mounts were lean and powerful for war. Geopolitically, Hetao was a wedge driven deep into the Han map. It was a mere 300 kilometers from the Han heart, the capital, Chang'an. For the lightning-fast Xiongnu light cavalry, this was a journey of only a few days. This structure meant the Han's political center was permanently within the enemy's strike radius. When Xiongnu cavalry burned the Ganquan Palace during Emperor Wen's reign, they did so by striking straight south from Hetao, as if through an open door. Every morning, the Han Emperor could almost feel the chill from beyond the Yin Mountains reaching the Weiyang Palace. As long as the Xiongnu held Hetao, the northern defenses were a phantom, and Chang'an remained an insecure frontline city. The other critical sector was the Hexi Corridor. If Hetao was a tactical threat, the Hexi Corridor was the strategic iron chain that sealed the Han's fate on a macro level. Squeezed between the towering Chilean Mountains to the south and the vast Gobi Desert to the north, the Hexi Corridor was a 1,000-kilometer oasis passage nourished by glacial meltwater. It was occupied by the Xiongnu tribes under the kings of Shutu and Hunye. The corridor was the sole throat leading to the western regions, modern-day Xinjiang and Central Asia. By controlling this passage, the Xiongnu turned the 36 kingdoms of the western regions into their colonies and ATMs. The grain, handicrafts, and immense wealth from east-west trade flowed continuously into the Chanyu's tent. This transformed the Xiongnu from a purely nomadic power into a composite empire capable of extracting multiple economic dividends. To the southwest of the Han lived the fierce Qiang tribes. The Hexi Corridor acted as a bridge, linking the Xiongnu in the north with the Qiang in the south. The Chanyu was orchestrating a terrifying grand strategy. Once the steppe and highlands converged into an alliance, the Xiongnu could bypass the Great Wall and outflank the Han's Guangzhong Plain from the west and southwest. Furthermore, the blockage of the Hexi Corridor left the Han Empire geopolitically blind. They were unaware of other civilizations to the west and unable to seek strategic allies. Locked in a corner of the East Asian continent, they were forced to bear the full, concentrated weight of the Xiongnu war machine alone. In the autumn of 133 BC, a ghostly silence hung in the cold wind outside Yanmen Pass. Liu Che, the young helmsman of the Han Empire, known to history as Emperor Wu, finally decided to cast his most desperate gamble against fate. He was finished with 70 years of humiliation, of sending princesses and gold. He intended to tear up the treaties of compromise and bury the Chanyu, along with 100,000 of his elite troops, at the foot of the Great Wall, in an epic strategic ambush. This was the famous plot of Mei. The lure was a wealthy border merchant named Ni Yi, a titan of the clandestine trade between the Han and Xiongnu. Ni Yi knew the nomads' insatiable hunger for wealth. Carrying a secret decree from Emperor Wu, he risked his life to enter the Xiongnu court and offered the Chanyu an irresistible temptation. He claimed to have bribed the garrison of Mai. Once the Chanyu's army arrived, He would kill the local magistrate and open the gates. The mountains of silk, grain, and untold riches within Mai would become Xiongnu spoils. To support this century-defining deception, the Han Empire activated its massive state machinery. 300,000 fully armed Han troops, led by top generals, moved like ghosts to the northern border, concealed in the valleys and forests surrounding Mai. To make the scene convincing, the fields outside Mai were filled with untended livestock. 300,000 men held their breath, swords unsheathed, crossbows tensioned, waiting for the prey to step into the iron cage. The temptation worked. Chanyu Gunshan personally led 100,000 steppe iron riders across the border, charging toward Mai. However, just 100 li from the city, a microscopic detail tore a rift in the meticulously laid trap. As the apex predator of the steppe, the Chanyu felt an instinctive chill. He noticed that while the fields were teeming with cattle and sheep, there was not a single shepherd to be seen, and even the birds had gone silent. This unnatural stillness triggered the primal beast instinct etched into the soul of the nomad. Suspicious, the Chanyu halted his army and raided a nearby Han outpost, the Yanmen Beacon Tower. There, they captured a low-ranking Han officer. Under the glint of Xiongnu blades, the terrified officer's psychological defenses collapsed, and he revealed the staggering secret of the 300,000-man ambush. The Chanyu broke into a cold sweat. He realized he was standing on the threshold of hell. Without a moment's hesitation, he demonstrated the lethal mobility of the nomad. 100,000 riders wheeled their horses instantly, retreating north like a receding tide, abandoning even their heavy baggage. Having escaped death, the Chanyu laughed to the heavens and titled the informant Heavenly King, believing the gods themselves were protecting the Xiongnu. By the time the Han commanders realized something was wrong and charged from their positions, the grasslands were empty, save for the dust and horse manure. Emperor Wu's masterstroke, a plan that had drained the treasury and mobilized the nation for months, had ended in a dramatic, total failure. The consequences were catastrophic. Back at his court, Chanyu Gunshan was consumed by fury. The Han betrayal had ripped away the mask of hypocrisy between the two nations. The Xiongnu viewed it as an unforgivable conspiracy. The 70-year Heqin policy was dead. The Xiongnu war machine began a campaign of maddening vengeance. In the following years, Xiongnu cavalry poured over the border from the Hingan Mountains to the Hexi corridor. It was no longer about simple plunder. It was about blood-soaked punishment. Liaoxi, Yubeiping, Yanmen, Dai, the northern frontier, became a massive meat grinder. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were slaughtered or enslaved. The walls of the border cities were stained a dark crimson. Emperor Wu paid a harrowing price for his gamble, and the empire seemed to fall back into the paralyzing fear of the Baideng era. But was the plot of Mai truly just a defeat? As the reports of disaster snowballed into Chang'an, Liu Che, sitting in the Weiyang Palace, showed neither regret nor fear. The failure of those 300,000 men allowed him to see a cold, brutal truth. To use traditional infantry and static ambushes against the nomads was as futile as trying to catch the wind with a fishing net. If the Han Empire wanted to survive, it could no longer hide behind the Great Wall waiting for the enemy, nor could it rely on schemes to end the war in a single stroke. If defense was a dead end and traps could not catch the gale, the Han Empire had only one choice left: to become a storm faster than the wind and a beast more ruthless than the wolf pack. The old art of war was dead. 70 years of humiliation were crushed. A brutal era began in a bath of blood. Emperor Wu looked coldly toward the north. He knew that to destroy that 9 million square kilometer empire, he needed new tactics, new horses, and a breed of gods of war who could grind the Xiongnu into the frozen earth. At that moment, in the imperial stables, an illegitimate son named Wei Qing was silently tending to the war horses. In the courtyards of the inner palace, a youth named Huo Kubing was watching the northern sky with cold eyes. The most magnificent and brutal grand expedition in the history of cold steel was about to erupt from the ruins with a roar that would make the world tremble.